Good evening, and welcome to the third night of NavRatri, dedicated to Ma as ChandraGhanta, she who is crowned with the half-moon in the shape of a bell, to render it somewhat figuratively. Now before going further, and for that matter picking up the narrative thread where we left off with last night's Brahmacharini video, it is necessary to briefly attempt to explain some of the symbolism inherent in this theonym of the NavaDurga Aspect of Mataji. As you may remember, Shailaputri is crowned with the crescent moon. By this stage of the NavRatri cycle, this is waxed to a more full half-moon, as she has grown in strength and power, quite directly also in enlightenment. For such the moon is at night, a source of light for us down here on earth, and brighter in the heavens, in direct proportion to the luminosity it exudes. And in both cases, these moon crowns recall the theonym of Mahadev, Chandratikara, he whose brow is adorned with the moon. Or, phrased another way, they help to connote, via the sharing of this iconographic element between both Mahadeva and his Maharani, that she is his queen over the cosmos entire. As we shall see, it is entirely uncoincidental that the moon in question reaches this much more radiant and infilled state at this particular phase of the NavaDurga cycle, but more upon that in a moment. One of the most important elements of Ma ChandraGhanta's theonymic symbolism is to be found when putting the two words which comprise her name together, ChandraGhanta, literally moon bell. My mind, for some reason, enjoins me to suppose that this would be a rather ideal name for a cat, and this is not at all mentioned in the context of disrespect, but I digress. On the more obvious level, this name is supposed to connote the shape of the half or gibbous moon, which is kind of like a bell, composed of the light parts of the moon, and with the in or less visible portion representing the aperture at its base. But that is not all it is. For a Ghanta is not just any bell. Rather, it is a temple bell, one which is rung especially in the context of ritual worship, and to let the gods know that we are there at their abode. The ringing of such an instrument, therefore, does not simply produce an eminently sonorous tone. And truly, from my long hours by now at Mandir, I know a few other more beautiful sounds than that. But it is quite literally the sound of piety. When one hears it, the very heart of the devotee also resonates with it, becomes one with the sound, and is gladdened and raised in spirit and in bravery and moral fortitude. As we shall also see, this becomes most especially relevant and resonant at this particular point in the NavaDurga Mythic Cycle. And as a brief footnote, before we once more launch into that, joins an array of other moon-based, semi-visual puns that I have quite some enthusiasm for in the Shaivite Durgan corpus. The best known example of which, perhaps, is the mythical sword Chandrahas, the laughter or the glinting smile of the moon, due to both its shape, like a scimitar or curved sword, as well as its pre-Ravana owner and wielder, Lord Shiva. Onwards. When we last left our divine pairing, Ma as Brahmacharini had successfully made it to the seeming pinnacle of her journey's quest, finally managing to gain the attention of Lord Shiva via long periods of tapas and other ascetic pursuits in emulation of him amidst the inhospitable crags of the Himalayas, and through a personal evaluation carried out by him in concealed form, in order to adduce what lay in her heart and whether she was a true match. The next part of the story comprises their journey back down the mountain, metaphorically speaking, and despite my much favoured maxim about how it may take 1,000 steps to ascend a mountain but only one to come down, as we shall see, the errant simplicity implied here, hence why I often use it to counsel addicts, does not strictly apply in the case of Mahadev and Parvati's next stage of their journey together. For it is not simply enough that they now have each other's hearts. In order for things to truly be made right, they must be properly married. And despite Mahadev's occasional cheerful disregard for the ordinary bounds of propriety, not least because, well, even leaving aside his status as the Adivraksha, he is the absolute, is proprietary himself after all, and therefore is not to be weighed down by the petty concerns of lesser figures, still much less the spiteful tones of Arti-cle inclined least men amongst them in polite society, but perhaps motivated out of a desire to avoid a most emphatically regrettable repeat of what had happened with his previous father-in-law, wherein the father-in-law in question's fractious regard for him had rather directly led to the death of Sati. He undertakes to do things properly and get the approval of her father, King Himavat, for their blessed marital union. Now this is where the complications begin to ensue. For you see, for whatever reason, King Himavat, perhaps overburdened with pride, perhaps simply motivated by the protective nature of a father for his cherished daughter, does not see the great god when he looks upon this errant suitor for Lady Parvati. Rather, he sees a vagrant, a ruffian, a drug addict, an outlaw, an interesting rendering for Vracha, a figure with the look of a criminal, who is keeping the most unsalubrious company of wild men ascetics, ghosts, and even demons. All things considered, an unruly chap indeed, and at stark and direct contrast to the role of a king to rule, and well below both the station of a princess and also the king's expectations of a figure capable of providing for his daughter in the manner to which she deserves. This, needless to say, creates a bit of a problem, particularly when the Barat, the traditional armed procession which accompanies the Dulha, the groom, to the house of the prospective Dulhan, bride, in order for their marriage to take place. When the Barat arrives at the gates of the king's palace itself, for there, Queen Menavati, the mother of Parvati this time around, and the wife of Himavat, beholds this unvarnished image of Shiva surrounded by his retinue, and faints in terror at the sight. Now, while I'm sure many of us have been in relationships wherein our partner's mother has perhaps not taken the greatest shine to us, this might seem like a bit of an overreaction. But consider that in a manner rather similar to many of the fierce aspects of Matadi, such as Matakali, to the uninitiated or the impious, or indeed the unfamiliar, Lord Shiva can appear most terrifying indeed. After all, it is right there in the theonym of Bhairava, and is one interpretation or translation of the name of Rudra. And this is before we factor in how frightening it must be to behold the Boleki Bharat, the fiends, ghosts, wild men, Vracha, Pishachas, Rakshasas, Agoris, Sadhus, and so forth, wreathed in clouds of cannabis smoke, bearing fearsome weapons, and bedecked with bones and cremation ground ash. Upon seeing this, Parvati takes action. Assuming the moonlit mantle of the ChandraGhanta aspect, she intervenes, enjoining Lord Shiva to take on a less frightening visage. I am sure many girlfriends have had not entirely dissimilar conversations with their men, ordering them to scrub up in order to make a better impression upon their parents when meeting them properly for the first time. While ChandraGhanta's radiance illuminates the scene for what it truly is, and dispels the fear from the hearts of her birth family and their courtiers in just the same manner that the clarion ringing of a temple bell and a hand in a Abhaya mudra does for the devotee. Although it is a potentially interesting point to note that the ringing of the ChandraGhanta does not per se dispel or banish the revenant retinue of Mahadev in the manner that one might potentially expect given ChandraGhanta's broader mythological role and portfolio beyond the NavRatri cycle, but rather it simply enables them to be regarded for what they are, not mere fiends or marauding apparitions and outlaws, but instead the trusted retainers of Rudra, here as a traditional and expected customary part of the marriage ritual. Light, in other words, can be a weapon, especially against the darkness, Asura, but it can also illuminate to show what is actually there, and changed the way we see things to make the seemingly dangerous or hostile into something proper or non-threatening, friendly even, potentially making staunch allies out of what appeared to be enemies when the truth of matters is illuminated, as happened here in the revelation, that what might have been a besieging army of ghosts and fiends and outlaws was in fact the mighty sinner of one about to become family. In any case, it is most apt that it is the moonlight we are speaking of here, for it is the light that shines the light which shines the brightest and most beautiful amidst the darkness of the night sky. A veritable beacon that can guide us, help us to keep time, and there is a deeper Sanskrit meaning here for those of you who can see it. Perhaps consider it moon runes, as it is the principle by which we organize our religious calendar, and perhaps most important, because it too moves in cycles. It goes away, but then after a period of pitch-black utter dark, it comes back. Just as Lady Parvati did for Mahadev, even from the death which had engulfed Lady Sati. Most eloquent and elegant, indeed, in the multi-layered symbolism which can be bound up in such an evocative visual metaphor. Anyway, once the frightful disruption brought on by the arrival of the Bharat and the fearsome visage of Lord Shiva has been overcome thanks to the timely intervention of Parvati, the blessed marriage can finally take place, a glorious reunification, customarily regarded as having occurred upon what we now observe as Mahashivratri, not coincidentally talked about as the darkest night of the year, and when the moon is otherwise all but spent immediately prior to entering its Amavasya, no moon phase, thus rendering it additionally fitting for the sudden and perhaps unexpected bright radiance of the ascending moon to appear in their and our midst, along with Shiva, who is symbolized with the sliver of silver and also the darkened moon that remains inter alia. Therefore, when put together with his wife, making one whole, or almost thereabout, and transcending the bounds of time with the bonds of love through the appearance of this nearly full moon at the opposite point in the lunar cycle to where it otherwise would be beheld. And also, as I mentioned towards the outset, a further reason for the ChandraGhanta theonym, as now both husband and wife, king and queen of the cosmos, and crowned or adorned, and in that matter adored, appropriately. The Ananda couple then proceed to the next phase of their narrative together. Now to turn to the broader saliency of Ma ChandraGhanta, both within but more especially beyond her role in the NavaDurga cycle. It is not coincidental that this is also the first warrior form proper to be found amidst the NavaDurgas, for she has quite the patron role of demon slayers and soldiers against the Arya and Arita forces against which we must inevitably contend. Just as the sacred light and radiating peals of her moon bell help to drive away darkness and stir the hearts of devotees, so too does her mere presence inspire abject terror and dissolution in the demon, even as it exerts a greater astral warrior's ardor and imparts bravery amidst those fighting on the side of the righteous. As ever, and there is even a Rigvedic attestation for this, the weapon of piety is the greatest bane for the opposers of Dharma. The surest, Surah est, strike against the adversaries of the gods. The aforementioned Rigvedic citation I have in mind is the 24th of Mandala 2, dedicated to Brihaspati, whom we have identified as another form of Shiva, often accompanied by Devi in the form of Vach, speech, in which Vala, the brother of Vritra, is slain through the weapon of prayer, which also, to quote, dispelled the darkness and displayed the light of heaven, end quote, 224 line 3, Griffith translation. This compares interestingly with several of the other hymnals detailing the same or similar encounters, in which the weapon used is referred to as thunder, or the Vajra, which, as a result of the more than occasional coterminity of Vajra and Trishula, in terms of symbolism and impact or effect, should not necessarily be taken as lacking in Shaiva resonancy. Meanwhile, in others, the weaponization of prayer is perhaps less direct, in at least one case being employed to conjure a meteor from the heavens to obliterate the foe via orbital bombardment. And in another set, before the confrontation against Vritra, we have Vash declaring she shall go with the warrior lord to solve their dragon problem and make him invincible in any consequence. Prayer is presented repeatedly in a Rigvedic context as a truly mighty armament. This is further borne out by the course of events via which the otherwise invincible demon Durga Masur is finally brought low and defeated as related in the Devi Bhagavatam. Indeed, so formidable a force is this that it is precisely the knowledge, and therefore the power through performance, of the rituals of the Vedas that Durga Masur strikes at in order to attempt to ensure his invulnerability. The plan doesn't ultimately work, however, as despite the lack of Veda-provisioned empowerment for the gods at large, the combined effects of prayer to bring Adi Shakti in her manifestation within the universe, first as Ma Shakambari and then as Durga, manage to set the universe back into balance through the judicious application of most eminently necessary holy carnage. Of course, in addition to the twin virtues of piety and perspicacity, as well as the courage, which she amply demonstrates inter alia in being right when others are wrong, communicating honestly to her parents, and being able to look past the terrifying to see what is truly there, and compassion, which complement these most excellently, she is also very well armed, being conventionally depicted equipped with the Trishula, the three-spear usually of Mahadev, which also signifies power throughout the three worlds, and is therefore something of a dynastic symbol for the divine family, as well as being a superweapon and visually recalling both the mountains and the storm, as well as the forces of the universe entire, including the power to destroy the universe entire. The bow and arrow. This also connotes Shiva, and with that carried by Durga, is identified further with Vayu in particular, who is also Shiva, and in addition to being a most potent weapon, represents the ability to fly straight along one's spiritual path with both speed and accuracy. The sword. This is Devi's own, and prominently figures in relation to, for instance, the famous Bhavani Tulwar and other related blades, although in some tellings the sword wielded by Durga may perhaps be regarded as being from Lord Yama, Death himself, or one of the deaths we should say, which also represents, in addition to its supreme death-dealing and mastery powers, the illuminating powers of intellect and knowledge, the infinitely keen edge being correlated with the keen mind, a sharp mind, and thus entailing also a power of discernment, most appropriate for ChandraGhanta, as well as the ability to sever the ties of karma, which can weigh down upon a soul. It may also be correlate with the general carrying of cutting and hacking instruments by several aspects of Durga, which are utilized to decapitate, to sever the encumbrance of overweening pride, arrogance, and ego in much the same manner as her husband's judicious use of the axe against certain figures such as Sati's father, or even Brahma Prajapati. The Gada, a club or mace, a significant symbol also of rulership and the Dumazilian second function. Consider the golden mace that is the ensign of the power of the Speaker of Parliament in many Westminster democracies, which is also identified with the Vajra carried by both Lord Indra and in somewhat less direct form Lord Hanuman, Bajrang Bali, who, while definitely carrying a Gada and strongly identified with such, is not as frequently depicted with a Vajra in the more direct form, despite it literally being right there in his name. This represents the potent, overwhelming force to smash and to subjugate the obstacles within one's path, as well as being a symbol of the respect and majesty of one's people, and, as noted above, via Brihaspati in particular, may further be correlate with prayer and piety itself. Lord Vishnu is also frequently identified with the Gada. In addition to these more overt armaments, she also carries a Ghanta, a ritual bell. This symbolizes, as noted above, piety, connection to ritual and prayer, the presence of the divine, and the dispelling of illusion and fear through its peals. The Kamandalu, as will be recalled from yesterday's post for Ma as Brahmacharini, this water vessel is used by both ascetics and those conducting rituals, as well as potentially containing the Amrita, or special sacred waters of particular holy rivers. The Rudraksha Mala, like these, also known as Japa Mala. It is translatable as the tears of Rudra, or the eye of Rudra, after the name of the seeds which form its beads, of a special additional significance considering her husband. These are utilized in the chanting of mantras and the carrying out of prayer, and come to think of it, with another meaning of Aksha in mind, that of the axis, the notion of the Rudra axis, that is to say, Rudra as the axis about which all pivots the Chakravartin, and or the axis of Rudra, about which Rudra embraces and cherishes. This would comport well with both the Shaivite and Shakta cosmological interpretations, dependent upon direction and inflection, indeed both at once. The Kamala, the lotus flower, connoting beauty, the manifestation of life even in barren places, due to how it grows, the divine recurrent life in the sense of both immortality and the coming back from death, the importance of which ought to be plainly obvious here in the NavaDurga cycle, through its association with enlightenment and transcendence. This too is regarded as a weapon upon occasion, and is a continuance from Shailaputri's carrying of same. The Abhaya Mudra hand posture, which conveys the removal of fear as well as the dispelling of evil, and is frequently seen upon murtis, as well as being performed by a number of the NavaDurga specifically. And, dependent upon local tradition and constructional rendering, she may also bear the conch shell, a war trumpet of clear relevancy to her portfolio and characteristics and functions, especially pertaining to the battlefield and the rallying of men's spirits and drawing force to one. Also utilized in ritual and prayer, as well as having a potential symbolic connection with Lord Varuna. It resonates with the sound of Aum, which recalls not only Durga's mastery over the various forces of creation, the very forces of creation I should say, but also the instance wherein with a mere Humkara she reduced a particular formidable demon to ashes. This too can be thought of as the power of prayer in action. As well as a hand in Gayan Mudra, a posture or gesture which is associated with improving the powers of the mind, of recognition, recollection, clarity of thinking, concentration and calmness, as well as mental well-being. A whetstone verily for the twin blades of brain and bhava, spirit. And of course she is adorned with the fabled moon crown, which provides her namesake, and is often depicting radiating a halo of soft light, much like the moon does in the night sky, and is accompanied by her Vahana, mount or vehicle, Dawan, the fearsome lion or tiger, whose very name means bravery and whose roar both heartens those who fight alongside them, her devotees, while unutterably terrifying those who dare stand against her. Rather like the roar of Rudra in some regards, come to think of it, the peal of thunder and the howl of the storm wind. With all of this in mind, then, it should come therefore as no surprise to find that we regard ChandraGhanta as embodying the twin virtues of beauty and grace, which of course go together to produce martial prowess, as well as having deep and complex wells of meaning to them even in themselves, such as the intrinsic correlate of bravery with righteousness, and of spirit, the courage to speak up and do what is right, and grace with deftness, dexterity, and of course beauty, including the supreme beauty of piety, as well as the more perhaps plainly visually apparent sense which she is possessed of in most perfect abundance, as well as charisma, the power to draw and rally others to one, which is vitally necessary for any general and any community, and, as it happens, for any queen in the true sense of the word, rather than the mere title holder contingent entirely upon the powers of others. Most vitally and intrinsically, her undeniable perspicacity and the plenipotentiary powers and faculties of mind.